here in Genesis 29. And of course, we'll go back over a little bit of how we got here, but not too much. You can look these up on YouTube or ask me and I'll find you the page for this. So if you want to go and look back at some of the other lessons, they're just this format. So it just basically records what we're doing here. But, you know, we're systematically going through Genesis. We're just talking about the major points of history, some of the major things that have happened so that we can kind of scoot along the timeline of the Old Testament. We are ignoring some things, not because they're not important, but just because not everything seems to be necessarily on the timeline that we're going to be going through. I'm mostly hitting the big ones for sure. So today we're going to talk about Jacob, and Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. Abraham was the first family member of what we would now know as the Israelites or the Jews. Abraham was the first one that God called, that he made a covenant with him. He made him promises. Am I frozen again?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
He's a grandson of Abraham, and what?
Okay. So Jacob's a grandson of Abraham. Abraham was it looks like you're frozen again. Oh, my goodness, I hope this doesn't happen all night. Jacob was the first family member, or Abraham was the first family member of what we now know are the Jews, who was called by God, had a covenant made with him by God. If you remember, God called him away from his people when he was 75 years old. He pulled him away from his family. He sent him to what we would now know as the Promised Land or Canaan. We're all frozen again. We might need to reboot. Do you think I need to reboot? Are you getting to hear anything, or am I just frozen? Is everyone frozen?
I can hear you, but your camera freezes for a while, and then it speeds up a little bit, and then it kind of goes back to normal. So
all right, let's press on then, I suppose. So I just went back to Abraham, told you God had a covenant with Abraham. He pulled him out of his family land. He sent him to Canaan or Palestine or the Promised Land. They're all the same place. You know, the question is always, did the Israelites ever get to the Promised Land? Well, they started in the Promised Land. That's where Abraham was. And so there were a few times where he, what we would call self-exiled himself. In other words, he took himself out of the Promised Land. Sometimes he went to Egypt because there was a famine. He was considered a prince of the area. In other words, when he wanted to bury his wife Sarah, he went to the people of the land and said, I need to buy some land to bury my wife. I want to bury her here. And they said, you're a prince among us. You're a big man among us, and you should have whatever you want. And so they were really generous to him in that way. He did, however, buy some of the land that where he buried his wife, which was significant because he now not only had land because God told him that he would have that land, but he also had purchased some of Canaan, some of the Promised Land. So that wasn't considered, as far as I can tell, necessary, but I think it's significant. So Abraham and Sarah have one son named Isaac. Abraham does have other children, but the promise is coming through this one son. Remember, this is the time of the patriarchs. And, you know, funny that we talk about this in a ladies' class, right? But women were largely used as currency. Women were largely used to expand families. We're going to see in this week's lesson from chapter 29 that Jacob actually has two wives, and his family grows even larger because of his two wives and both of their maids that they also gave to him to have children with. But when a man decided to marry a woman, the woman's family only had to agree, and then they would get married. Of course, in the case of Isaac and Rebekah, they did ask her if she was okay with it, and she was. Abraham wanted a wife for his son from among his people. We don't really know at this point. We do know from earlier in Genesis that the cultures were separated, that the languages were separated after the Tower of Babel. So we do know that there are some cultural, language, and possibly at this point DNA distinctions between people. We're not really given a description about what their bodies look like or their skin looked like. So, you know, as we view race today, I don't know exactly what it looked like back then. We do know from Acts chapter 17 that everyone came from the same man, which I think is pretty cool. Or some versions will say the same blood, that we're all from the same blood, which is also very cool. But we do know that Abraham wanted his son Isaac, the son of promise, who was going to be the patriarch of the family when he passed on. He wanted him to have a wife from his people. So he sends a servant back, and he gets a woman named Rebecca, who is gorgeous in every way. And she is the sister to Laban, Laban. And Laban is a strong person in our story today. That's why I'm giving you a little bit of this background. Isaac is married to Rebecca, whose brother is Laban. Rebecca is brought to Canaan. Abraham's very clear, do not take my son back where my people are from. He's to stay here because that's a land of promise. And Rebecca comes with him back to Canaan. Isaac and Rebecca have twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the oldest, but Jacob supersedes him or supplants him, the word is. And he does in every way. He does when he's being born. Esau comes out first and Jacob has a hold of his foot. And he later tricks Esau out of his birthright, which is all the property and position. And then later he tricks him out of his blessing, which is the blessing of the pretty much what God had given to Abraham and to Isaac is going to be passed down. So we have Jacob and Esau, these twin brothers. Jacob has tricked Esau. Esau is furious. This is where we ended last week, and he wants to kill his brother. So his mother gives this story of these terrible, terrible women that are here in this land. I can't possibly imagine my son marrying them. So you need
Jennifer,
to stay away.
is
Yes.
that hand thing on Tori's post face that she's raising her hand to ask you a question?
Let's look. Let's ask her. Tori, but her microphone and her video are not on. Tori, do you have a question?
I guess not.
That's all right.
I just never had seen that before.
I'm sorry. I just couldn't. I'm trying to bounce back and forth. So I loved when we studied this on Sunday in Bible class. Kirk actually had a comment after class that not everyone was privy to hear, but I got to hear it and I love it. So I want to share it. So in Hebrews 12, verses 16 through 17, it suggests that Esau was more of a secular minded person, and Jacob was more religious minded. And so whenever I think of the question of Hagar and Abraham kind of had sin, but that didn't work out. And then there was sin of deception in this story, but it worked out. So why did it not work out in one and work out in the other? And so Kirk was saying possibly based on that Hebrews 12 passage, that Esau was more secular and not as religious, or not as spiritual minded. And so God wanted the person that was more spiritual minded, even though that person made mistakes and did something that was wrong,
Hmm.
to continue the lineage. Made sense to me.
Well, it's an interesting question because it's sort of like, you know, Abraham is the father of faith, but he lied and he took this woman who wasn't his wife. And you know, you can list the things that we know about him that are not moral, and you know, have a problem with them. And of course, if they're wrong, they're wrong. But there was, you know, the New Testament says that there was a time that God overlooked ignorance. There was a time he was withholding judgment. It didn't mean that the things that they did weren't wrong. For instance, a deception, lying who you are. You don't see it here in Genesis, but you'll see it later in Exodus, that bearing a false witness is wrong, right? And lying about it is wrong. So what he did was morally wrong. And it appears, I guess, and I wasn't actually in that Bible class because I was helping with the babies class, but I did hear some of that discussion later. And I think, you know, the question was, why did God reward Jacob if Jacob was deceptive? When in reality, I don't think it was a rewarding of Jacob. And it wasn't a rewarding of Abraham for lying. And it wasn't a rewarding of these sinful behaviors. It was more working with that behavior. The lineage of the Israelite people wasn't about the merit or the godliness of the people, because they were very godless. They were very immoral. My Hebrews 12:16 says that Esau was immoral and godless. And it really talks about how he despised his birthright and rejected it, and how foolish that was. And I don't disagree with Kirk that Esau was not a godly person, but I have to tell you, I don't see in these early days that Jacob is a godly person either. You know, all we know about him at this point is that he's tricked his brother out of his birthright, took advantage of him. He knew he was starving, and he tricked him into giving his birthright. And then secondly, he tricked his father, lied to his father, and tricked his brother out of the blessing. But we know from before their birth that Jacob was to get the blessing and the birthright. We know that. We were not told how that was going to happen. And it doesn't mean that what they did was right, even though God did work it out for his plan throughout the Old Testament. So, you know, people have a problem with that and they try to reconcile it, and I get it. To me, it's no different than what happened in Exodus chapter 1, where they talk about the Hebrew midwives who were given the command to kill the baby boys. And they said, we just can't, those Hebrew women are so hardy, we just can't even get to them. And God actually honored them for that. Now, it doesn't say specifically that they lied, but it sure sounds like they were lying to Pharaoh about that. And yet they were blessed because they were furthering the bloodline, not because of what they chose to do to further the bloodline, but because they chose to honor God instead of Pharaoh. So you're going to have some things like that. And on some of this, we are skipping over some of that stuff just because, you know, like I said, we're hitting mostly the big points and the highlight points. But you have to, it's very difficult when you put our morality and our sense of morality and trying to rid the sin of our lives on the people of the Old Testament. They still, I believe, will be judged for the sins that they committed, just like we will be, unless they, you know, had their sins washed away like we have and the hope that we have. But God's plan for his people still worked through these shysters and deceptors and liars and murderers. It still worked through those people. The things that David did were despicable, and yet he was still honored by God, and he was held up for years, centuries to come after that. And even Jesus held up King David. And
Mhm.
compared to Jesus, he was morally bankrupt. Mike had preached last Sunday about how he really pretty much used his position of being a king to get what he wanted for his own pleasures. I mean, that's despicable. If we had a president today and he were caught in the kind of sins that David was caught in, I mean, that is just absolutely despicable. And yet God still used him. So not to moralize on that too much, but I did want to address that because you're right. You have Jacob and Esau, and they both are doing wrong things. It seems more like Esau is just foolish, but you can't ignore Hebrews 12 that says he was immoral and godless. The book of Hebrews is pretty great for shedding a little more light sometimes on the Old Testament. So I don't know where I was in the timeline, but where we are today is Jacob has deceived his father. His brother is furious at him and wants to murder him. He is giving him a little bit of time because he doesn't want to murder him while his father is still alive. And so Rebecca is aware of this, and she tells her husband, I can't imagine him marrying one of these awful, awful women around here. Send him back. So, that's an interesting thing. Would he have been sent back to Abraham's original people had they not had this deception and this problem? We don't really know, but we do know that he was sent back to the same bloodline or the same people that Abraham came from. So Isaac sends him back to Haran, which is where Laban, Rebekah's brother, is. Laban, when Rebekah was going to be married, seemed like he was already acting like the patriarch of that family, and he still is. He has two daughters that we know of that are talked about in this, and they are Rachel and Leah. So they are Rebekah's nieces. So these would be Jacob's cousins, his first cousins, Rachel and Leah. And that kind of takes us to where we are today. How do you feel about reading, Suzanne? Want to read?
Okay, sure.
Thanks. So we're in Genesis 29. I really would like you to go all the way through verse 20, if you don't mind.
Okay. So Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. And he looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks. A large stone was set on the well's mouth. Now all the flocks would be gathered there, and they would roll the stone from the well's mouth, water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the well's mouth. And Jacob said to them, My brethren, where are you from? And they said, We are from Haran. Then he said to them, Do you know Laban, son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. So he said to them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And look, his daughter Rachel is coming with the sheep. Then he said, Look, it is still high day. It is not time for the cattle to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go and feed them. But they said, We cannot until all the flocks are gathered together, and they have rolled the stone from the well's mouth. Then we water the sheep. Now while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. And it came to pass when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel, and lifted up his voice and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's relative, and he was Rebekah's son. So she ran and told her father. Then it came to pass, when Laban heard the report about Jacob his sister's son, that he ran to meet him, and embraced him, and kissed him, and brought him to his house. So he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, Surely you are of my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month. Then Laban said to Jacob, Because you are my relative, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful of form and appearance. Now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And Laban said, It is better that I give her to you than I should give her to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they only seemed a few days to him because of the love he had for her.
Okay, so the beginning of this story, Jacob goes to the land of his people. He begins to kind of inquire, you know, where he is exactly and who the people are around him exactly. There's a well, and there were sheep that were there. And it describes the well to you, even though later they describe it as well. In verse 2, it says, now the stone on the mouth of the well was large. And then verse 3, when all the flocks were gathered there, they would then roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep and put the stone back in its place on the mouth of the well. And this was somewhat significant. I mean, I don't want to make too much out of this, but he sees these shepherds there. They are waiting. And he pretty much says in verse 7, do your thing, you know, water the sheep, go water the sheep and then pasture them or take them out to eat, which is not take them out to eat, but take them to the grass to eat, which is interesting because it seems as though he's come upon these shepherds and he's almost like an authority figure. You know, he starts to tell them what to do. I don't know if that was because of how he was dressed and they knew that he was not a slave, or they, you know, they could identify him somehow, but they treat him very respectfully. He's not yet told them who he is, but for some, or maybe he's just a bossy guy who goes right in, assesses the situation and tells them what to do. You know, I have been accused of that before and it's been true. So then in verse 9, he sets he gets his first look at Rachel, and while he's in the middle of talking with them. But what they did say, by the way, before he sees Rachel is, well, actually what happens is we all gather the sheep, and then you see what they say, and then they roll the stone from the mouth of the well. It's almost like they're waiting. They're not going to go ahead of what the protocol is and what they're allowed to do. So you can see that they are servants in this role. Then Rachel comes up and she's also a shepherdess slash a servant, seems to be in this family. Verse 10, he sees Rachel and he sees the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, and he decides, Jacob goes up to the stone and rolls the stone away. So whatever authority they were waiting for, he just takes this into his own hands and handles it. We're not told it's because he was super strong and able to do it. You know, we're not told that these shepherds were boys maybe and not physically able, but for some reason they were waiting. And he does that for all of them. In verse 11, then Jacob kisses Rachel. This isn't a romantic kiss. This is a family kiss. This is like familial kiss, and lifted his voice and wept because he now has a family member. And they had already told him in verse 6 that she was coming, so he knew who she was. But in verse 12, now he tells her who he is, that he's a relative of her father and that he was Rebekah's son. And so she goes and tells her father, who is Laban. This is very significant. It's significant when you have a family member come, and you're going to see a little shift in position here, because where he might have been above these initial servants and in authority to them and possibly to Rachel here, he now goes and meets Laban, who is the actual patriarch, and he is under Laban's authority. That's just how it works in these families. Verse 13, but Laban embraces him joyfully. He kisses him like a family member, just like he did with Rachel, embraces him and brings him to the house. And in verse 14, surely you are my bone and my flesh. So, you know, he accepts him for who he says he is. Interesting, isn't it? There's no, I don't know, maybe you don't do this, but sometimes when I meet people or hear about them, what do? I go look them up on Facebook, right? I go see who they are. I see if I know anybody that they know, or if I'm contacted by somebody, I want to see their face, or when any family members or friends had kids who were interested in significant others, you better believe I got that name and looked up everything I could. Anyway, there was nothing like that. He didn't bring papers to say who he was. It might have been a look to him where he looked like the people from that area. We don't know. But he definitely accepts it. And then Jacob stays with him for a month. It made me think of the movie Elf, where Elf comes and he's found his family in New York City, and they're like, "Oh, you're here, how nice, and how long do you plan to stay?" And he says, "I was thinking forever, I'm just gonna stay here forever." Well, Jacob has no plans. Remember, if you look back a couple of pages, his mother had said in chapter 27, she said, verse 44, stay with him a few days. This is her brother. Stay with my brother a few days until your brother's fury subsides, and until your brother's anger against you subsides and he forgets what you did to him. Then I'll send for you and get you from there. So I don't know that he knows how long it's going to be, but Jacob has come with nothing, and he is staying with his relatives. By the way, you see how he didn't come with flocks, and he didn't come with gifts, and he didn't come with cattle. He just fled. But he stays with him in verse 14 for an entire month. And after the month, we're not really told what he did. I read several commentaries on this, and a lot of them were really bent toward Jacob was not accustomed to doing any work, and so he was laying around for a month and not doing anything. I don't know that you can read that into this, but then they said, so Laban was like, so since you're going to be working for me, you can't do it without a wage. That was how he brought up the subject of you have to be working. Our scriptures don't actually say that, but it does say, you're my relatives. It doesn't mean you should work for nothing. What would you like to work for? And it's a very significant conversation because of what Jacob says his wages are to be. Skipping down to verse 18, Jacob has been there all of 1 month, and suddenly he deeply loves Rachel in a month. So he fell hard for Rachel. But going back to 16, it describes that Laban actually has another daughter, and there is an older daughter named Leah, and Rachel is the younger of the two. We're not told how much time there is between them, what the age difference is, but we are told that physically one is not as attractive as the other one. Because Leah had a problem with her eyes. It says her eyes were weak. It could be cross-eyed. It could be dim or partially closed. It could be that she was not able to see, had very, very bad vision. We don't really know, but weak is a very difficult description, isn't it? Because beauty changes from century to century and culture to culture, so we don't know what weak meant.
Jennifer,
Go ahead, Nancy.
my version says Leah was tender-eyed.
Tender-eyed.
Yeah.
It's worse. That's worse than weak.
Yeah.
That's less descriptive to me than weak.
Right. She couldn't see if she went out in the sun or, if there was a light shining or something.
I don't know. Maybe she had icy blue eyes that we would now consider so beautiful, but at the time they were like, ugh, she's got these weird colored eyes. Who knows?
Because everybody else had brown eyes, yeah.
Yeah. Who knows what it was, but it was not considered attractive at the time. That is definitely true. But Rachel in verse 17 was beautiful of form and face. So everything about her was attractive. And Jacob loved Rachel, and so he decides my wages are going to be that I'm going to serve you for 7 years, and you will give me Rachel. So we just read in our Bible that this woman is considered a wage for work. Now you could think of it as like a dowry. I don't know that that's much better, really, thinking about that. But it's what it was. This is what the culture was like at the time. And Laban's like, okay, sure. I mean, it's better that you have her than some other stranger. You know, you're my family. At least that would be good. And he agrees to let him stay there and work. And a very beautiful verse, Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they just seemed like they were nothing at all because he was so interested in being with her. Let me see if I missed any notes. So it is kind of significant to think about how in this culture, it wasn't like they were, you know, dating and boyfriend and girlfriend now, you know, they go off on their own and they have dates and whatnot. It wasn't like that. They probably had very minimal contact, probably saw each other from afar. Definitely wouldn't be any of the romantic kissing, you know, like we mentioned in the beginning where he kissed her and embraced her because she was his family. There's probably less of that now because she's considered, you know, a potential mate for him. So they had very strict rules, even if you were betrothed or engaged. Those are, I don't know, words we would use now. Even if it was agreed upon by your family that you would become married at some point, they did not touch each other. Let's see. So moving on in my Genesis 29, the heading of the next several verses is Laban's treachery, which is really where everything kind of goes haywire. Suzanne, will you read for me just from 21 to verse 30?
Yep. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go into her." And Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast. Now it came to pass in the evening that he took Leah his daughter and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. And Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a maid. So it came to pass in the morning that, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, "What is this that you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me?" And Laban said, "It must not be done so in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and we will give you this one also for the service which you will serve with me for another 7 years." Then Jacob did so and fulfilled the week. So he gave him his daughter Rachel as wife also. And Laban gave his maid Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a maid. Then Jacob also went into Rachel, and he also loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years.
Okay, thank you. So the 7 years are over, and Jacob gets to marry the woman of his dreams. He gets to marry Rachel, but he finds out after the wedding night, after he has already had sex with her, that this is not Rachel. This is not the promised wife. This is the wrong sister, which is pretty significant because where were the girls in this switch? You know, where was there? You just wonder where they landed on this, right? Was Leah thrilled because she loved Jacob? You know, we're not really told about that at all. Even later, we'll read more about their story, and we're not told of either of their great love for Jacob necessarily. But, you know, was Leah okay with this because at least she does get a husband with those weak eyes, right? Did she ever not have a hope of this? We don't really know. You know, different commentaries said she might have loved him. It might have been her only chance at getting married or having a husband. Beauty was very important at the time. I mean, we knew that Sarah was beautiful. We knew that Rebecca was beautiful. Now we're hearing about Rachel being beautiful. And all three of those, it was about their physical body. It wasn't about 1 Peter chapter 3, which talks about the hidden person of the heart. So beauty was important at the time. But why did Rachel go along with this? You know, because sometimes we read this story and we're like, well, Jacob just loved her so much and he was so desirous of her that, you know, verse 20 says he worked for 7 years and it was like nothing because he was so enamored with her. But we're never told of Rachel's affection or feelings for Jacob, whether she was interested in marrying him or not. If the 7 years were a long time or a short time for her because of her great love. And then the wedding night, and Laban, who is the wealthiest man around, Laban invites all these people and has a huge feast, a huge celebration. And we're not told of their custom or why Jacob did not know that this was not his wife. It said, in the evening, he took his daughter Leah in verse 23 and brought her to him, and Jacob had sex with her. This is not the right girl. And then in the morning, verse 25, behold, it was Leah. So is it the light of day? Was it just really dark?
Right.
I don't know. We don't know. Some people talk about the Jewish custom of a veil. But then if you read other things, they say that the veil actually came because of the whole story of Jacob and Leah. So what came first? I don't know. Either way.
I wondered also, because it was this huge feast. Let me see what that
Verse
sentence.
22.
Yeah, it says, and Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a feast.
Mhm.
So if they had all of these huge flocks of sheep and cattle and all of that, and Laban knew a whole lot of men for sure.
Mhm.
So maybe Jacob and all the other men were drunk.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that's why he wasn't aware. Maybe he was too drunk to see who was coming into him. Now, I don't know that. Of course, we're not told that. But that, to me, that makes sense because it tells us that Laban had this huge feast.
Yeah.
So,
Maybe he was impaired in some way.
yeah.
Well, whatever it was, he regretted what he did for sure, because
Yeah.
in the morning it was the wrong woman. And you don't use the phrase, but you don't unring the bell. This woman is no longer a virgin. This woman is no longer
Right.
what they would consider a pure, eligible virgin. She has
Right.
been defiled, and on a wedding night. So it
Yeah.
seemed like it was all up and up, but she's the wrong girl. She's the wrong girl. So,
But her face was covered, so he didn't see her. And yes, like you said, that once they had, that he had gone into her, as this script says,
mhm.
she was no longer available for anyone else. But he didn't know what she looked like, it sounds like, till the morning. And I would think how different that is from our custom today. I mean, we would never, as on our wedding night, have our face covered the first night,
Mhm.
And he didn't know, and maybe it was so dark after they went to bed that he couldn't see her face either. Or as Nancy said, he could have been drunk. We don't know. But the other side of it is, you asked a while ago about what about Rachel. I think Rachel didn't do anything because that's what her daddy told her.
Mm-hmm.
And if her dad told her this is the way it's going to be, you don't argue with dad.
Mhm. Yeah, so the system of the patriarch had absolute authority. So they
Right.
could have gone along with it. We're not even told of her choice within, getting married, or Leah's choice in any of this. This was all the discussion among the men.
Right.
So we're not told about Rachel, but I did kind of wonder if there was a decoy bride, during the ceremony, like if they lost her during the feast, what exactly all happened there. But would have been a very interesting story for sure. We're only given like 3
Right.
verses.
That veil must have been really, really thick, right?
It might have
He
been.
couldn't see through.
It might.
He obviously did not kiss her during the ceremony either, or he would have raised the veil and knew it was the wrong woman.
I don't know. But it will tell you that he was likely not physically very familiar with her.
Right.
Right.
Because he didn't even know which sister he had. Every commentary I read, though, said that the trickster got tricked. It was like a comeuppance. It's you reap what you sow kind of thing, which, you can't really deny that. Jacob was such a a deceiver and a tricker, and then he gets ultimately really tricked. This is really, it really sets the course of his life to have.
The tricker was tricked by another better tricker.
Yeah. Don't mess with Laban. Laban is really tricky. He really is.
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, and so then 26. Well, first of all, 25. Jacob is frustrated. He says, "What have you done to me? Was it not for Rachel? You know, I served you. We understood this. We made an agreement. Why have you deceived me?" And Laban's like, "Well, you just don't know the way things are around here, right?" He's like, "I thought you knew. I mean, the older daughter's got to be married before the younger, or didn't we tell you, about this?" So then he says, "It's just not our practice. This is the way it has to be." I mean, 7 years is enough time to explain that to somebody, though, before they have this wedding. It was clear that he was deceiving him on purpose.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so he says in 27, "I'll tell you what, complete the week out with this one, and then you get the next one after next week, after this week." And so he did so. He completed her week, is what it says. The only week Leah had with her husband without a very ferocious competition with her sister for the rest of her life. So in 28, he completed her week, and Laban, it just says he, but Laban gave him his daughter Rachel as his wife. And so you also find out here that in 24, Laban also, after he initially gave Leah, he also gave Zilpah to Leah as her maid. Very important because she also bears children to Jacob. And then later
Mhm.
down here in 29, now, so Jacob now has Leah has Zilpah as her maid, Jacob now has Rachel as his wife, and Laban gives Bilhah to his maid Rachel, or to his daughter Rachel as her maid. So verse 30, now Jacob sleeps with Rachel. So Jacob went into Rachel also. Indeed, he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban for another 7 years. Laban's the perfect manipulator, and he got exactly what he wanted. Both of his daughters are married off. Again, we don't know if there were other children. We're not always told about all the people that are in the story of the Bible, obviously.
Right.
We're told about the parts that matter. But he probably remembers back from chapter 24 when Abraham's servant came to get a wife for Isaac. He probably remembers the great wealth of Abraham. And that is the family that these women are going back to. And they're both going to be taken care of. But they immediately begin to have problems because, first of all, Jacob's married two women. This is the first person in this line of Abraham that has taken 2 wives. And I was reading about how they say 2 wives at a time instead of 2 wives in succession. Because Abraham, if you remember, he did get married again, and he did have more children. But he did not have another wife other than Sarah at the same time. Isaac has only been married to Rebekah. He does not have another wife. Esau has more than 1 wife, at least 3 that we know of at this point. And now Jacob, who is going to be the patriarch of the family, has 2 wives. And to make things worse, they're sisters. And to make things even worse than that, everyone knows that he was tricked into marrying the wrong sister, and that
Right.
he had an agreement to marry the one sister who he was crazy about, his favorite. He loved her more. All of those are problems. And they end up having, which we're not going to talk about tonight, but they end up having what I call a conception war. I'm going to have this child, and then I'm going to give my maid, and then we're going to take an account of how many kids you have and how many I have. And they even have times where they compete for who is going to sleep with him that evening.
Right.
We'll talk later about how he came in from the field and Leah said, I've purchased you with my son's mandrakes. You know, I've given this so that you will be in my bed tonight. So that is
So
not a good situation. Go ahead. Is that you, Fiona?
yeah, he not only gets the two sisters, but he gets each of their handmaids. So he started out wanting one woman and he got four.
Yeah, right.
And then you say, and then they bid on him on which one gets him that night. And I mean, there's no way. I said, it's a good thing I never had a sister. I only had brothers.
Mm,
I would not done well with sharing my man.
yeah, sister wives for sure.
Right, right.
Mm.
Yeah,
But
and
that was the accepted thing then. I mean, nobody thought of that being impure. Nobody thought it being out of the ordinary. It was what they did. And that was the way you built your family. And that's how you expanded. And that's how you procreated to have, you know, the population increase. A man had several women that he was having babies by, which
and
is
a lot of
oddly, because
children.
we're right back there again today where men are having babies with 4 or 5 women at the, you know, same time. And they tell them, you know, their baby daddy's here and baby daddy's there and all over. And I'm like, it's very much the same, but very different, you know?
Yeah, really, in our culture, it actually goes both ways.
Yeah.
Plenty of,
Yeah.
plenty of men having children they shouldn't be having, and women, same thing for the women. But I will tell you this, and I do think we have to be careful the way that we frame this, and that is, Jesus said that, you know, there's one woman and one man for life. You know, that is the plan.
Right.
And that would have been the plan from the beginning. That's what Jesus had
Sure.
said. So, you know, one man and 4 women does not fit that pattern. So, you know, even though it might have been the way that they did things then, it doesn't mean that God was pleased with this behavior. Even though they didn't get swallowed up into the earth for those kinds of things and had an immediate like physical punishment, it doesn't mean that he was okay with what they did. God did not give Abraham 2 wives. He gave him one wife,
One.
and he was very wealthy, and he had, like I said, he was considered a prince among people because he was so wealthy, and he had servants galore. Remember, he gathered 300 men to fight against the 4 kings back in Genesis we looked at before. So he had people who had been born under his roof who were considered part of his household. And so even though I know you weren't saying this was the right thing to do, Fiona, but even
Oh,
though
no.
in that time they had considered, well, I have more wives, then I'll have more sons, and then I'll have more workers, and then I'll have more, you know, all of those things. God could multiply them. God could do all of that within his system, which I believe is one husband and one wife. So,
Yes.
and I know you were not teaching that. I always
Right.
want to teach that as our language, you know. Just
Mhm.
because it was allowed did not mean it was okay.
Right.
Yeah, I've actually even heard in the New Testament, they'll talk about, you know, elders being the husband of one wife. And I've even heard them say, well, one wife at a time, as if,
Well, I've heard that too. And I'm so adamantly against that because I don't think it says anywhere in the Bible one at a time. It says one. And I think that means from beginning to end.
that's right.
For an,
Have to be
you know,
real careful on how we say some of those things, because we want to please God. We want to do exactly what he wants. And like I said, there'll be other things too in the Old Testament that we come across and we're like, that doesn't seem morally right. Why is that okay? And going back to Tori's comment about Jacob, you know, I don't believe that Jacob was honored because he deceived. I think he deceived, and it was he was still part of God's plan, and God was still going to use him.
that's what I was thinking when she was talking about in Hebrews, and not to say that Hebrews isn't a backup for it, but in the beginning, it's like we talked last week. The original plan was that Jacob was supposed to get this. Why he thought he had to do it his way when God had already said this when the child came out. you're going to follow your younger brother, and he's going to look up to you, and he's going to honor you, and you're going to be in charge of him. But he and his mother seemed to think they had to do it on their timeline, not God's timeline. And that's kind of like we go back to Sarah. You know, God said that she would have a child, and she laughed. They waited 27 years. How many of us today would want to wait 27 years to have our first child? I mean, you know, it's all about God's timeline. It's not about what we want or what we like. It's about what honoring God. And he said, it's going to happen. And you just be patient and trust that he says it's going to happen, and it will. But I looked at the same way that they were doing it. Is like with Sarah, it's like, okay, well, I'll go and get a handmaid for him and he can have a child right away. Well, that's not what God said to do.
Right. And he works with us in spite of us trying to run ahead of him. I really think that's what we ought to get from the Old Testament. In spite.
Yes, and I think that's amazing. And we should never forget to be grateful for that. Even though everything is not done in the right order for God, he still honors us and uses us to do good things.
Right. Right. I mean, it's easy to look back and go, those knuckleheads, they just had to be patient and hold on. Right.
Right.
But, you know, they were just they were doing what seemed right at the time, which is not always right.
Right.
All righty. Well, it is 7:30, so it's time for us to close, and it's getting a little chaotic over here. But
Yeah.
I love you all, and I'm very happy to see all of you
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Angel.
next week.
Bye-bye.